All right, great. So yes, thank you for having me here today. I'm really happy to be here to give you some information about ClinVar and how it can help you with your activities as part of the ClinGen Biocurator Working Group. So before I really get into it, I do want to put in a quick plug for getting your feedback. We're always interested in talking with users so we can understand better what you need from ClinVar. We do have some upcoming user interviews in May. So if you're interested in volunteering for that, or if you just want to just generally let us know that you're open for giving us feedback, just email me and let me know. We always need people to contact to get your opinions. So for today's talk, I'm going to start by giving just a little bit of background about ClinVar, just to make sure we're all on the same page. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about details of the ClinVar web display, and then we'll talk a bit about searching ClinVar. So as most of you probably already know, ClinVar is NCBI's archive of interpretations of variants relative to conditions. And the data that you see in ClinVar are considered variant level interpretations. There's been different words used over the years for this kind of an interpretation. Sometimes it's been called an assertion, the clinical significance, an interpretation. More recently, people are using the word classification. So several of these words you'll see in different places, both in this presentation and on the ClinVar website. But the important thing to note is that we are always talking about a variant level interpretation, a general interpretation of the variant for disease, not specifically for a patient. All the data is public and available for any use. And it's a submission-driven database. We'll talk a little bit more about that as we go through the talk. And it's also supported by curation from our staff here at NCBI. The important thing to note here is that we are not curating the interpretation. We'll talk a little bit more about what we are doing with the interpretation, but there are some other kinds of curation support that we do, and that'll come up more towards the end of this talk. So ClinVar has become a global database. We now have 1.4 million submitted records that have come from 1,800 different organizations across the world from 82 different countries. And there's lots of different kinds of groups that submit data to ClinVar. So the vast majority of data does come from clinical testing labs. You can see that on our submitter page. Most of the groups that are our top submitters are the clinical testing laboratories, particularly in this country. But we also get data from research labs, from locus-specific databases, from OMIM and gene reviews. We're starting to get more data from clinicians and patient registries. And then, of course, we also get data from expert panels and professional societies. So no matter who gives us a submission, every record in ClinVar has 4 major domains of data. So every record has a variant, a condition, an interpretation of how that variant relates to the condition, and then there's evidence for the interpretation. And the evidence in ClinVar is structured as observations. And each observation has these minimal fields: the allele origin, typically that's just saying whether it's germline or somatic; the affected status of individuals in whom the variant was observed; and the collection method. So that's asking, how did you collect the data for this interpretation? And that's typically clinical testing or research. So one thing to note, particularly the evidence on a submission can vary a lot from submission to submission. And a couple of examples I can give you. So a typical submission from a clinical testing lab would look something like this. So they would give us a variant, a condition, they would give us their interpretation of the variant, and they would give us just very simple evidence, usually a single observation. They aggregate all of their observations into one. And so they might just tell us, yes, this variant was observed in germline because I do germline testing. I don't know the affected status of individuals with this variant because the testing lab typically does not see the patient. They know it's from clinical testing, obviously. And sometimes, particularly for CNVs, they might also know observed clinical features. The testing labs often give us more information that is connected to the interpretation. So they might give us a comment, if that's the blurb where they explain why they classified the variant as they did. They might give us citations. the date that they last evaluated that interpretation, and the mode of inheritance. If you'll bear with me one moment, I'm going to make my screen full so you can see the full slide. All right, so that's a typical submission from a testing lab, but submissions can look a bit different. So let's say a research lab gives us a submission. They may give us similar information for the variant, the condition. They may give us similar pieces of data for the interpretation, but their evidence could look very different. So researchers typically have access to the patient, so they have a lot of information about that person with the variant, and they often have consent to share that information. So on a research submission, you might see much richer data on the observation. So in addition to those minimal fields, you might see other things like the age, the sex, zygosity, observed clinical features, the ethnicity or population group, and other kinds of pieces of information. Another thing you might see is a research lab might actually split out their observations into more than one. So they might actually give one observation per person. So let's say they looked at a family. So the first observation is describing the proband, and then they give two other observations, one specific to each parent, and they could give you information specific to each of those individuals. So that's just to point out that although we have this similar structure for the evidence, it's pretty flexible, and so you can see different kinds of information on different submissions throughout ClinVar. So the scope of data that you'll find in ClinVar is fairly broad. So variants can be anywhere in the genome, and they can be any type or size of variation. So we include data from all the way from SNPs up to large copy number variants. Most data that you'll see in ClinVar are interpretations for single variants, so an interpretation of a single SNP or a single CNV. Occasionally, it's important for the submitter to make an interpretation based on the combination of variants, so as a haplotype or a genotype, so we do accommodate that, but most of the data you'll see are for single variants. The conditions their variants are interpreted for include diseases, phenotypes, and drug responses. So it's most typical for a variant to be interpreted for a single disease or drug response. We do allow combinations, and that typically happens when someone is interpreting a variant for a novel disease that hasn't been named yet, and it's just defined by a set of phenotypes or clinical features. So that's typically when you would see a combination in the condition. And then finally, the types of interpretations that you'll see in ClinVar include interpretations of pathogenicity for Mendelian diseases, variants that are interpreted for their relationship to cancer, and then pharmacogenomics variants. So I mentioned earlier, ClinVar is driven by submissions of data, but we also add value to that submitted data in a few ways. The first, of course, is our primary function to archive those submitted records. So in doing that, we assign an accession number. So that's the SCV accession number that you see in ClinVar. That gets assigned to each submitted record, and each one also gets a version number, which means we can track changes to those submitted records over time. We standardize and validate data wherever we can. There's more information about this online, but I'm not going to go into detail about that today. And then thirdly, in addition to archiving the submitted records, we also aggregate them. And we do that in a couple of ways. So we aggregate submissions that are for the same variant into records that have a VCV accession number. And then we also aggregate records for the same variant and disease pair. And those get aggregated into a record with an RCV accession number. So for today, we're just going to focus on records that are aggregated by variant, so the VCV records, because that's what you see when you look at the ClinVar website. So that is our segue to next. We're going to look at the ClinVar web display. And before we look at the record in detail, I do want to zoom out just to give you the big picture and kind of give you the lay of the land for variation pages. So we've already talked about in ClinVar, we have submitted data, and then we also have aggregate data, and that's how we've laid out the page. So the top section of a variation page is the aggregate data. So this is data that we've aggregated or calculated. And then the next section really focuses on the data that was submitted to us. So we're going to start at the top of the page in the aggregate section. So the dark blue bar here has the title for the page, describes the variant. And then it's followed by the light blue section here, which is a summary of information about the variant. So this includes the aggregate interpretation. So this is something that we calculate. It's based on submitted interpretations, and we'll talk a little bit more about how we do that. Following that is the review status. So that's the stars that you see on ClinVar records. That gives you an idea of the review that supports the submitted interpretations and therefore the aggregate interpretation. We'll also talk a bit more about that. And then I also want to call your attention to the VCV accession number. So this is the record, the accession number for the variation aggregate record. You can see it has the version number here, so you know when there's been a change to any of the underlying submissions. And you can see there is a relationship between the variation ID. Probably most of you are familiar with the variation ID. This is the number that we use to make the VCV accession number. All right, so next, let's talk a little bit about review status. So this is something that we calculate, and we calculate it based on three things. So first, we look to see if the variant has been subject to expert review. So if the variant has been reviewed in a practice guideline, that's our highest review status, that gets 4 stars. Or if it's been reviewed by an expert panel, that's the next highest, and that gets 3 stars. So you all are probably very familiar with the 3-star records. If a variant has not been reviewed by an expert group, we then look to see if there's consensus in the interpretation. And then we look to see if we have transparency into the rules that our submitters have used for interpretation. And so that refers to assertion criteria. That's the document that we ask for in ClinVar submissions that describes the categories that you use to classify variants and what criteria you need for each category. So if for a variant, we have both transparency into the classification rules used by our submitters, and we have consensus in the interpretation across different submitters, that variant gets 2 stars. If we have transparency into the classification rules, but we don't have consensus, either because our submitters disagree on the interpretation or there's just a single submitter, that variant gets 1 star. And then if we don't have transparency into the classification rules at all, that variant gets 0 stars. So this table is really a summary of the review statuses. They're all listed in detail on the website if you're interested in more information. So part of the reason we have review status is to give you an idea of the trustworthiness of a record. And we also use that aspect of it in calculating the aggregate interpretation. So to remind you, every submitted record in ClinVar has an interpretation that came from the submitter. And then we calculate an aggregate interpretation for the VCV record, for the variant record, and we base it on the submitted interpretations. And you can see I bolded the word calculated here. That's the important point to know, that there's no person at ClinVar who's making a decision about what that interpretation is that you see at the top of a ClinVar record. We are calculating this following an algorithm. So the way we do that is we select SCVs or submitted records that we're going to include in this calculation, and we do that based on review status, what we just talked about. And we use an order of precedence. So if there's a submission from a practice guideline, we use that. If not, and there's a submission from an expert panel, we use that record. If we don't have either of those, we then look for submissions where the criteria was provided. So that's the single-star records. And if we don't have any of those, we then go to the 0-star records, those without assertion criteria. So once we've selected the SCVs that we'll use in the calculation, we look at them and we ask, do these SCVs agree or disagree on pathogenicity? And here we're specifically talking about the ACMG terms from benign to pathogenic. So we look for agreement, and some of the possible kinds of results we can get here are something like pathogenic. That means that all of the SCVs reported the variant as pathogenic. We might get something like pathogenic / likely pathogenic. That means that some groups said pathogenic, others said likely path, but we don't consider that to be a conflict. We just report the combination. We do the same thing for benign and likely benign. But if there are other kinds of differences, so either of the pathogenic values versus uncertain, or versus either of the benign values, or a difference between uncertain and either of the benign values, that's considered a true conflict. And then we report the aggregate interpretation as conflicting interpretations of pathogenicity. And then there's a second field that lists out what those interpretations are and how many submitters reported each one. So many of you may be aware that we also have other terms for interpretation in ClinVar other than the ACMG term benign to pathogenic. So the last step is we look at the SCVs and say, do any of them have interpretations other than those ACMG terms? And if they do, we just tack it on to the end. So for example, we may have a variant that's, people agree it's pathogenic, but we also have a submission that says it's involved in a drug response. Or there may be agreement that the variant is pathogenic or likely pathogenic, but it's also been reported as a risk factor. So these are not considered conflicts. It's just multiple types of interpretations for the variant. And again, more information about clinical significance and how we calculate this is available online. So that is the summary section at the top of the page. It's followed by 3 tabs of more specific summary information. So the tab you see by default is called the Variant Details tab. And this has general information about the variant, not specific to any individual submission. So this is things like the genomic location, HGVS expressions, links out to related information. So for example, this is where you find the ClinGen allele registry ID, links out to locus-specific databases and dbSNP. The second tab in this section is the Conditions tab. So this gives you a summary of all the conditions that have been reported to ClinVar for this variant. So we list out each condition. There's some summary information for the interpretations for each one. And you can see here, we talked earlier about, we also aggregate data by the variant and condition pair. And so that gets aggregated into an RCV record, which we link out to here. For a case like this, these two descriptions of the disease are not very different, so it might not be useful to look at the RCV record, but sometimes these are very different and it can be useful just to go to the variant disease record. And then the third tab in this section is the Genes tab. This summarizes the gene or genes that are affected by the variant. The vast majority of data in ClinVar are small variants like SNPs. So typically this table has a single row. So the variant is typically just within a single gene. This example is a little bit unusual. So this variant is in LDLR, but there happens to be an antisense gene on the opposite strand. And this variant is in a location that overlaps both genes. So we give you that information as well. I also mentioned earlier that ClinVar also includes CNVs, some of which are very big and span many genes. So for those on the Genes tab, you'll typically see a much longer table that includes all the genes that are involved in that CNV. So that is the top section of the page that focuses on the aggregate data. And then next we're going to scroll down and look at the section that focuses on submitted data. So the main focus of this section is this table called Submitted Interpretations and Evidence. And in this table, each row represents a submitted record. So you can see here the SCV accession number that was assigned to each submission by ClinVar. You can also see the review status that was assigned to each record. Again, that's calculated by ClinVar. But otherwise, all the other data in this table is displayed as it was submitted to us. So you can see the value that this submitter gave for the interpretation, the disease they interpreted it for, their comment and any citations that they provided on the interpretation. So this is, you can also consider this to be kind of summary level data. We talked earlier about the evidence that's provided can sometimes be much richer. And so we don't typically display that at this level, but you can click out on this link that's called Evidence Details to see more detailed kind of information. If you click Evidence Details, you'll see those details for a single record, but if you want to see it for all records on this page, you can click this link under Supporting Information that says See All, and you'll get a big table where you can compare data across all the submissions. If you scroll down from the Submitted Interpretations table, you'll see a new section of the page for functional evidence. So we are starting to get more submissions to ClinVar that specifically focus on functional assays. So there's no interpretation of clinical significance. It's really an assay to look at what's the effect of this variant on the protein function. And we discovered that the The submitted interpretations table is really not very informative for that kind of submission. It's not very clear what the submission is based on the information we have in that table. So this is new. So we're trying to surface some of the more of this functional data on the front page. And what we show is the value that the submitter gave us for the functional consequence of the variant, a description of their method with a citation, the specific result of this method for this variant, and then they may also have a longer comment about the functional consequence of this variant. So this is a bit of a work in progress. It's pretty new, so you may see some changes to this coming up in the future. But we do know how important functional evidence is for the kind of curation that you all do, so we want to make sure that it's pretty clear when it's available in ClinVar. So the final section of the page focuses on citations. So we have this big table here of citations for the variant. Most all of these come from submissions. We have a very small number that have been curated by our staff, but we really don't have a lot of person power to do literature curation. So almost everything you see in this table has come from a submission. One thing I will note is that we do sometimes get citations here that are not specifically about the variant, but it is a paper that one of the submitters consulted while interpreting this variant. So we do sometimes get questions about why is this paper here? It doesn't mention this specific variant, but if it's something that was used by a submitter as they went through their interpretation process, they may have included it in their submission. So that's why you might sometimes see a paper here that you don't recognize it as being directly about this variant. And then finally here, we've also added a section that links out to text mine citations from LitVar. So LitVar is another NCBI product. It was developed by Zhang Liu in our research branch. And there's a link here for more information about how LitVar works. But basically it does text mining of citations in PubMed and looks for papers that are about variants using the RS number. So we thought this would be a nice way to supplement the papers that we get from submissions. That we know this is not comprehensive, so this supplementing it with text mine citations is a nice way to help you get a broader start to your literature search for any variant that you're interested in. All right, so that's the web display, and now we're going to shift gears and talk about searching ClinVar so that you can easily find your way to the record of interest. So before I get into it, I do want to point out we have a nice YouTube video that describes searching ClinVar, and it'll cover a lot of the things that I'm going to talk about today. I can make my slides available, so this is a link that'll help you get to the YouTube video. And we also have some very detailed information on the website too, if you're interested in digging into more specific kinds of searches. So we're going to talk today about different kinds of searches, these 6 kinds that I think are probably useful for the kind of work that you do. I'll talk about the kind of results you can expect to see, and then some things you might need to be aware of or tips that might help you in your searches. One thing I want to talk about before we get started is give you this general idea about searching in ClinVar. So ClinVar is an indexed database. So that means that we index particular fields of data, so the values that are found in each of those particular fields, which means that you can make a very specific search by saying, search for this term in this field. The flip side of that is that if you don't specify which field you want to search for your term in, we will search all fields for it. And this means that sometimes you get some results, some search results that are not quite intuitive. And I have a couple of examples of that in my examples coming up, so I'll point those out when we get to them. So first we're going to look at searching by gene symbol. This is a really common kind of search in ClinVar. And this is one actually where we can help you out a little bit. It's easy for us to detect the official HGNC gene symbols and presume that you want to search for BRAF as a gene symbol. So for gene symbols, we actually do this for you. And this is a good kind of a search. It is a little broad. So you can see we got 500 results here. And that can be good depending on what you're doing. If you're trying to survey all the variants in a gene, you're trying to look at the spectrum of mutation for a gene, this could be useful. But often people need to filter this down to something much more specific. So we do have this list of filters here on the left that can help you get down to a more specific set of results. I couldn't fit the whole set here on this screenshot. So on the next slide, I've just pulled them out so you can see there's various things like the clinical significance, molecular consequence, variation type, the allele origin, various things here that we think these are the most frequent things that people need to filter their results on. So these are right on the search results page. You'll see there's a number after each of the values. So this tells you how many records meet this filter. So if you were to click on conflicting interpretations, you'd get 21 BRAF variants with a conflict. So we have these right on the search results page, but there are actually a lot of other ways that you can filter your results too. And you can find those by clicking on the advanced search link here. So this takes you to the advanced search builder. You can use this builder to make a really complicated search, but it doesn't have to be complicated. Sometimes this is just useful to help you structure a simple search, but in an easier way than typing it in yourself. So for example, you see here we have these pull down menus here that ask you what field you want to search in, and there's an open box here to say what term do you want to search for in that field. And so let's say you want to find all variants in BRAF that are new to ClinVar since the beginning of the year. So that means you would say search in the gene name. I want variants in BRAF. And I'm looking for a curation date from January 1st of this year to the present. And then when you do that search, you can see you get 16 results. So that can also be a nice way to do find new things in a gene, things that have changed since the last time you looked at ClinVar, and other more specific searches. So gene symbols, as I mentioned, are a good search, but they are pretty broad. If you're looking for a very specific variant, I recommend that you use an HDVS expression if you have it. Particularly, I recommend using a full HDVS expression with the full accession.version and the change. This is ideal. It's unambiguous. You know exactly where the change is. But I also understand that particularly when you're doing literature curation, you don't always have that much information, particularly the transcript. So you can also do a search on something like what I'm calling a partial HDVS expression. It's like C.19 C to T. This works. It's just not always very specific. So for example, if you search ClinVar now for C.19 C to T, you get 108 results. And of course, that's because many genes might have a C to T change at cDNA position 19. So that is why I recommend using a full HDVS expression whenever you can. Again, recognizing that you don't always have the transcript if you're doing literature curation. A fairly good proxy for that is to use the gene symbol. So doing a query like KCNQ1 C.19 C to T would give you a much more specific set of search results. Another thing I want to note is that in these results, a lot of these look pretty obviously like what you were looking for. So several of these look like C.19 C to T, and you can see it right in the title here. This is clearly C.19 C to T, so is this one. But the third result here, you can see the title of it is C.161 C to T. And sometimes we get users asking us, why did I get this? This doesn't seem to be what I was looking for. So if you get a result like this, I would encourage you to click on it and take a look, particularly at the HDVS table, because you always need to be aware of alternate transcripts. So you can see for this gene, MECR, there's several RefSeq transcripts here. The primary one that's main select is the one that we use for the name on the ClinVar record. So that's the one where the variant is at C.161, but you can see the second transcript here has the variant at the location C.19. And so that's why this variant came up in your search results. So it's not always obvious from the search results table, but you can often dig in and find the information here. Another good kind of search term to use is an RS number. So RS numbers are great because they're used everywhere. They're in the literature, they're in other databases, and of course we have them in ClinVar. The only thing to remember with an RS number is that the RS number represents a type of variation at a location on the genome. So for example, my search term here, RS206076, It represents single nucleotide variation at this genomic location. And it includes all three variants G, C, and T, which have been observed at this location. So this makes sense in dbSNP because dbSNP is cataloging variation across the genome. But in ClinVar, what we're really looking at is what's the relationship of this specific variant on a disease or a phenotype. So in ClinVar, our records are variant specific, but in dbSNP, they are clustered based on the type of variation at a location. So the important thing to remember here is that if you search on an RS number in ClinVar, it can be completely valid for you to get more than one record. And you can see for this example, we actually have 3 variants at this location in ClinVar. So we have records for all 3, the T, the C, and the reference allele, which is G. So it's a good kind of search term to use. You just need to make sure that if you get back more than one result, that you are careful about which one you look at. Another good kind of search term to use is a protein change. And by that, I mean a term like A100S or ALLO100-SEER. These are good also because they tend to be in the literature a lot and in other databases. The only drawback is that they are kind of like the C.19 example that we looked at earlier, in that they're not very specific. So for example, if you look for A100S in ClinVar, you get 13 results. And again, it's because multiple genes can have a nucleotide change that results in this protein change. Another thing to be aware of, so related to, we talked about alternate transcripts earlier. The downstream effect of alternate transcripts is that you can have alternate isoforms of the protein. So again, your first few results here, these are obviously A100S, 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 and then you get to the 4th result here, and this one says it's A110S. So again, if you look in the column here called protein change, we do list out the various protein changes that are reported for this variant. And so you can see A100S is the 2nd one here. And if you looked through the HDVS table, you'd find there's an alternate transcript where this variant is at a different location. So you just have to be aware that when you use a slightly less specific search term, you're going to get a few more things maybe than you expected to. This is also a good example of what I pointed out earlier about if you don't specify which field we should look for A100S in, we're going to look for it everywhere in the record. So this particular result is a little confusing. You don't see A100S here in the protein change column at all. But if you dig into this record a little bit more, you'll find there's a comment somewhere on the record where someone mentioned some, maybe something like, this individual also had an A100S change in something. So when you get a result like this and it doesn't look immediately obvious, it's a good idea to look around in comments to see why it's there. Okay, next we're going to talk about searching by disease and phenotype. So you can certainly do these kind of searches in ClinVar. You can look for both disease terms for things like Lynch syndrome and terms that are more like phenotypes or clinical features, so something like gingival overgrowth. But there are a few things to be aware of when you do this. So I'm going to go through each of these examples and talk through it a little bit. So my opinion is that searching for diseases in ClinVar is a bit complicated, partially because I think disease names are often one of those pieces of information that's mentioned somewhere else in the record other than what condition did you interpret the variant for. So I would say typically if someone types in Lynch syndrome here, they're expecting to see a bunch of variants where it says this variant was interpreted for Lynch syndrome. And you don't get that. You've got some related things here, mentioned colorectal cancer that's related, but it's entirely possible that there's a comment on each of these records where they say something, related to Lynch syndrome. Maybe the patient was not determined to have Lynch syndrome. They also had Lynch syndrome, family history of Lynch syndrome, but it's not literally the condition that the variant was interpreted for. So this can be a confusing result. And searching by disease is the kind of thing that I actually do recommend that you use the advanced search for. And again, this doesn't have to be complicated. You can make a complicated search with the search builder, but it can just be a quick way to make a correctly structured search. So again, in the field menu here, you just select disease/phenotype. type in your term like Lynch syndrome, and then you get results. So this is a much filtered set of results. Previously, we got about 6,000 results, I think. Here you can see we get about 3,000, and it makes much more sense. We're now finding variants that were actually interpreted for Lynch syndrome. So I think this is probably more what people expect when they search for a term like this. So as I mentioned, you can also search for terms that are more like phenotypes or clinical features. And the thing to note about this is that phenotypes can be present in ClinVar records in a couple of different ways. So you'll recall the earlier part of my talk, I talked about the evidence that you might have. One of the pieces of information we might have on an observation are the clinical features that were observed in an individual. So that is, I think, the more typical place that you'll find phenotype information in ClinVar. And so let's say you search for something like gingival overgrowth, and you get back some search results, and you don't see that term anywhere in this condition column. So you might see things like this, where you've got some disease names. You might also get some variants, particularly copy number variants, where the condition is reported as C cases. So that's really more of an instruction to say, we can't specify what disease this variant was interpreted for, but please see the case level data, the observation data for phenotypic information. So when you get a result like this, I would encourage you to click through. And one way you can look at this is go to the conditions tab. I showed you earlier how this does give you a summary of the diseases that the variant was interpreted for, but we also give you a summary of clinical features that were observed in individuals with this variant. And indeed, you can see gingival overgrowth is one of the features that was seen in an individual with this variant. So that is one way you might find a phenotype in a ClinVar record. And the other is when a phenotype helps to define a novel syndrome. So we talked about this earlier too. Sometimes the interpreted condition is really a set of clinical features, not a disease name. And so sometimes you may actually see the phenotype name in this column. This reminder, this is the column that reports the condition that the variant was interpreted for. And you can't really tell very well from this particular display, but if you click through to this record and you go down to the table of submitted interpretations and evidence, you can see what's going on a little bit better. So you can see we have two records for this variant. The first one came in August of 2018. You can see from the method here, this is from a research lab. You can see from their comment here, this is a pathogenic variant associated with a novel neurodevelopmental disorder. And you can see they defined that novel disorder with this set of phenotypes, and gingival overgrowth is one of those phenotypes. This is a great example because you can also see that OMIM found this paper, and a few months later, they created an OMIM record for it and gave it a name, again, basing the syndrome name on the clinical features that are its cardinal features. So when you search for a phenotype, you might find it as the observed phenotypes within the evidence for the interpretation, or you might find it as part of the definition of a novel disease. Finally, PubMed IDs are also a good thing to search on, particularly if you're doing a lot of your work starting with a literature search and you then want to make a connection to ClinVar. This is another place where I do recommend that you use the advanced search to do this, not because it's complicated, just because it's easier than remembering what goes in the square brackets. And I will point out that typing in PubMed ID number, PubMed ID colon number, none of those work. So I do recommend that you either learn to do the structured query, or really just using the advanced search builder here is the easiest way to go. So you just, in the field, you select PubMed ID, copy in the ID number, and you can see here this PubMed ID is connected to 6 variants in ClinVar. Another thing I'll mention is it might also be helpful if you're already in PubMed and looking at the citation. You can scroll down the page, past the abstract and some of the other information, and you'll find a section called Related Information. And this gives you links out to other NCBI databases that are connected to this citation. So if ClinVar is in the list, you can also click on this link, and that gives you the same results we saw, the same 6 variants that are connected to this PubMed ID. So I had a few questions that Jenny gave me that she knew you guys were interested in. So before I pass it over to Jenny, we open up the questions from this group. I can address a few of them right off the bat. So as you're doing your curation, you might find that a variant is missing from ClinVar. So what should you do about that? We would love for you to submit that variant to ClinVar. You remember I said earlier, ClinVar is a submission-driven database, and that means all the variant data gets there because someone has submitted it to us. So if you're reviewing the variant for your VSEP and the VSEP is going to submit this variant to ClinVar anyway, that's sufficient. That's how you can get it into ClinVar. If the VSEP's not going to submit it, you can consider submitting that variant to ClinVar from your own organization. If it's coming from a paper, you can consider doing a literature-only submission. That means it can be a very minimal submission. Basically, you're just reporting the variant in the paper. If it's not in a paper, if this is a variant that maybe you learned from another laboratory while you're sharing private data, you could consider asking that lab to submit their data to ClinVar as well to get that variant in. How do I add an entry to a variant in ClinVar? So I interpret this to mean, how do I get another interpretation, my interpretation of a variant into ClinVar? And again, that's the same answer. All of the interpretations, all the variants are in ClinVar because someone has submitted them to us. So the answer here is the same one as on the previous slide. If your VSEP is going to submit it, that's how you can get it in. Otherwise, you can do a regular submission from your own organization. What if a variant is already in ClinVar, but it lacks a PubMed ID? So there's a few options here. Again, if this is a variant that your VSEP is going to submit to ClinVar, one way is just to include that PubMed ID on your submitted record, and that will get it in. Otherwise, you can do a literature-only submission that we just talked about. If neither of these is an option, you can always just email us at ClinVar and ask us to add the citation to the variant. So this is the kind of curation that we can do. We don't curate the interpretation, but we can say, here's another paper that describes this variant. Also, if you find that you're identifying lots of missing PubMed IDs, you might consider batching those into one message to us, once a week or once a month, whatever is reasonable, just to help us on our end handle that curation. This is my favorite question from the group. What can we do for legacy variants, things like OMIM variants with old nomenclature, like the IVS names? So as you can imagine, these were a problem for us. The reason they still have these names and only these names is because we can't handle them automatically. And we don't have a lot of curator time to curate these kinds of things. So we would love to have your help with this. If you do run across a variant like this and you know what the correct HDVS description should be, we would love for you to email us. Let us know the variation ID for the legacy variant. And let us know what the correct HDVS expression is so we can add it to the record. Or if you have already identified that we have an existing variation ID that has the correct HDVS, let us know what the variation ID of that second record is, and then we can merge the two records together so that we can get rid of that redundancy. Again, if you find that you're identifying a lot of these cases, or if you think you're going to start a curation effort to identify a lot of these cases, please think about sending this information to us as a batch with a standard format, and we can provide that format to you. Stephen Harrison had a group of curators doing some of this work over the last couple of years, and so we worked out a format where they can give us the information in a particular way, and then we actually have a script that can upload that information automatically, so it's very quick. And then finally, how can ClinVar help with reclassifying variants? So how can we help you know when you need to reclassify a variant? So there's a couple of ways we can push information to you. One is we have the follow button. So this is available on every variation page. And if you are following a variant, we can notify you whenever the aggregate interpretation of that variant changes. So for example, if a variant ever changed from, say, pathogenic to conflicting, uncertain to pathogenic, you would then get notification and you would know that maybe you want to go and reevaluate that variant. The other thing you can do if you want to be notified of other kinds of changes is you can create an alert for a saved search. So again, this uses the advanced search option. Here I've set up an advanced search. This is a little bit different from the one I did earlier. Earlier, I set up a search to look for new variants in BRAF since the beginning of the year. But here I did something a little bit different. Here I set up a query to look for variants in BRAF that have been changed since April 1st. So you're looking at the modification date as to indicate when they were when the record was changed. And when you do one of these advanced searches, you get this option to create an alert. And that takes you to My NCBI, where you can save this search and you can set up preferences to have this pushed to you so that you can know, hey, there's been a change to something I care about, and maybe I want to go reclassify or reevaluate that variant and see if I do need to reclassify it. So I just want to thank the ClinVar team very quickly. This is our group of developers, our curators, our management team, and then our leadership within the